Rosie, I've seen the statistic of an 8% increase in domestic violence. I'd love you to talk to me about how accurate those statistics are, particularly during a period when people were quarantining and in lockdown, and also about the impact of lockdowns on domestic violence.
Yes, and I think to your point, it's very hard to know as yet the full data. I think only time will tell as more research is done. But I think undoubtedly what we saw, what we heard, certainly what we heard from the National Domestic Violence Hotline, from national organizations and state coalitions and throughout the 56 states and territories, were the ways in which survivors were experiencing these increased risks. So as you mentioned, one of the ways in which someone who is choosing to abuse causes harm is often by isolating that person. And that was already a tactic before the pandemic. But again, when people had to isolate at home, not only because of the quarantine, but even afterwards, as people were trying to reduce their risks, it made it so much harder for individuals to be able to seek safety and support. They were also isolated from support networks. If people were no longer going to work, but working from home, if children were no longer, going to school, or even the ways in which it made it harder for someone who wanted to leave an abusive situation to find shelter, to find housing. Oftentimes people go and stay with family and friends. But of course, in the midst of the pandemic, that brought increased risks. Even domestic violence shelters struggled with the challenges in congregate living, how to keep survivors safe, how to be able to get extra funding for vouchers for people to stay in motels and hotels to try to reduce putting more than one family in a room together. So again, we also saw courts who moved to teleproceedings and only the most urgent proceedings. It made it much more difficult for survivors to go in, for example, and seek an order of protection. And at the same time, we also know that economic security is such an important factor. It can increase the risk of someone who's encountering economic barriers, and we saw the pandemic really exacerbate that. So as individuals were losing their employment or having reduced ability to do their work and get the hours they needed if they worked in the restaurant industry, hotel industry, so many different industries that disproportionately impacted women who oftentimes are already struggling with inadequate wages, right? Inadequate access to childcare, inadequate access to healthcare. All of these different factors were further exacerbated during the pandemic. So really it's been an opportunity to once again recognize why we need a much more holistic approach. And while on the one hand, we did see some rates of increase of people calling the police or calling hotlines, in some areas, there was a decrease because people did not feel safe in their homes to reach out for help. Some people also just had difficulty reaching service providers who themselves were struggling in the midst of the pandemic with how to adapt their services. So there were a myriad of factors, but overall, our nation's commitment to really address this, and certainly the commitment of the Biden-Harris administration to make this a priority, has made a significant impact to really try to continue to better address these issues, not only during the pandemic, but going forward, to have a much more holistic strategy in our nation's commitment to prevent and end domestic violence and all forms of gender-based violence.